Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is She Sews Happiness. My name is Mary Ellen, and in my video today I'm going to share with you my 5 top tips for creating professional looking garments. Now, the one thing that I've heard a lot of recently is that people are generally surprised to discover that I've been sewing for less than 2 years. I have. I am still very much a beginner sewist. Now, the thing people tell me makes it look as if I've been sewing longer is that my garments look professionally finished. And that to me is such a beautiful compliment to receive from fellow sewists. And if you're watching and you're one of those people who has said that to me, know that you've absolutely made my day. But the thing is, so much work goes into sewing that doesn't actually entail sewing. And the reason that my clothes might look professionally finished is because I've done the hard work to make them appear so. Now, whether you've been sewing for 2 years or 20 years, I think there are 5 key things that you can do to ensure your garments look professionally finished. So I'm going to share those with you today. Number 1, measure. I take my basic measurements quite a lot because I personally tend to fluctuate often. So I think every week or two I write down my measurements from scratch, so when I go to the patterns I know what my starting point is. Now, one of the things that really irks me is when I hear somebody complaining that they've made this pattern and it wasn't drafted for them. Whether it's naivety or stupidity, I don't know, but the thing about sewing is our starting point. If we are going to pick up a pattern and make it based on the measurements that are on the back of that pattern, we are going to get something that fits us exactly the same as we would if we shopped ready-to-wear fashion. Because the truth is, everything is created to a standard. The only thing that makes it different for us as sewists is that we can make the adjustments that you would get in couture fashion, for instance, that make that pattern perfect for us. So yes, I could make a size 16 or a size 14 or a size 18 and none of them fit me. And that's because they're just drafted to the standard measurements that that pattern designer uses, and it doesn't take into consideration whether I have narrow shoulders or whether I need a full bust adjustment or whether I need a bicep adjustment. All of these things have to be thought about by us as sewists, but that is where the power of sewing actually lies. It's in taking the standard and making it specific to us. Now, you could do that with ready-to-wear fashion if you were a master of alterations, but I actually think it's easier to start from scratch than it is to try to alter a garment that is already created. And for me, I think that's really where all the hard work is put in. Now, if you just want to pull out your pattern and make up whatever size looks like close to your measurements, that's fine, but in my opinion, you might as well go and shop ready-to-wear fashion because you're still going to have gaping necklines. You're still going to have arms that don't fit. Your waist is either going to be too tight or too loose. There's always going to be something wrong. But, and I know this is not what anyone wants to hear, if you want to get that perfect fit, and a perfect fit is the starting point to a professional couture-looking garment, you're gonna have to put the work in. It doesn't happen overnight, and you can't sew up a dress in a day unless it's a dress that you've tried and tested and have made several times and made adjustments to. Then that's when it's going to be easy. And to be honest, I love my tried and tested patterns. When I don't have a lot of time but I really want to sew, that's what I turn to. But if it's a new pattern, you have to realise you need to put the work in. And toiling, I know, is not fun. It's not easy. It's not what we signed up for when we made that decision to start making our own clothes. But that's really where the magic happens. Anything that happens after the fitting process is so simple. The fitting process itself is what makes things really difficult, but so much worth doing. I wouldn't skip the toiling process now for anything. Number 2, press. If you only take one thing away from my video today, learn this. The iron is the seamstress's best friend. Now, I'm going to be honest, my laundry pile is embarrassing. I really am never in a rush to attack the ironing, but when it comes to my sewing, I press religiously. I've had people tell me that they can't be bothered sewing and ironing because they just want to get the garment made, and ironing slows the entire process down. And I get it, it does. But unless we do these simple steps, we're not really fixing the problem of why we started slow fashion making in the first place. Really, I'm not interested in fast fashion anymore, whether that's buying it or making it. I'm trying to curate pieces in my wardrobe that will last and that will look professional, which is the key to what I'm doing in this video today. So basically I iron everything. I start from those creased pattern pieces that I pull out of the envelope. They get pressed. I get the pre-washed fabric that's been sitting in my stash for the last 2 months, and before I even try to cut it, I press. Every single seam, every single dart, everything gets pressed. And when you're sewing your darts, another tip that I would always tell people is to make sure you use a pressing ham, because when you're pressing your darts, you don't want to be pressing them flat on your ironing board. We're not flat. So what you actually want to do is use your pressing ham to press a little bit of shape into your garments, and that way you'll get a much more professional finish as well. Now, if you don't have a tailor's ham or a tailor's sausage, also handy for doing things like sleeves, what you should do is invest in one, whether buying it or making it, because actually if you make it, it's going to help you use up a few of those larger remnants that you've got lying around in your scrap piles. So it's worthwhile doing that. Now, if you don't press your garments, it is going to show. I'm not even an experienced sewist, but I can tell the difference between somebody who has pressed while sewing and somebody who hasn't. It's really simple. Number 3, understitching and stay stitching. So yeah, it's 2 things, but they essentially do the same thing. They ensure the professional finish of the garment by using stitches that are not actually in your seams. So these are steps I would never skip. And actually I discovered recently that I'm doing them even for patterns that don't require them. And I say don't require them, I mean they don't stipulate in the pattern instructions that you should stay stitch or understitch. That doesn't mean they're not essential, because in my opinion, they are. I think that's one of those things as well that comes with experience. So as I've been sewing now for almost 2 years, I'm more confident about doing things that the pattern tells me not to do. Or doesn't tell me to do, or I know a better way of doing things, so I'll maybe line a dress a different way to what the pattern stipulates and so on. And I do think that you do become more confident in your own abilities the longer you sew. Now, there are a few things that are changed dramatically by using understitching and stay stitching, and a couple of things in particular that are worth thinking about. Facings. If you have a facing that keeps popping out, there's a reason for that. You haven't understitched. Now, necklines or anything that's even cut in the bias, that's something you need to stay stitch, because what you'll discover is that if you don't, when you actually come to line it up with pattern pieces, things will not match. Again, taken away from the professional look of your garment. So it does take a bit of time, I suppose, to do all of this, but it's time worth investing, in my opinion. Number 4, seam allowances. Now, I know you're probably thinking the pattern tells you whether it's 5/8 of an inch or whatever, and that's true. Most woven patterns usually have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Most knits usually have 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. But what you have to always be aware of as well, that these do deviate from time to time, and you don't want to get caught out, because it can affect the overall finish and fit of your garment, taken away from the professional look that you can achieve by hand stitching. or homemaking, because not many of us are stitching by hand these days. But I think it's always important to check the instructions before you start, and always be aware that halfway through the pattern designer could have thrown something into the mix and maybe told you to change that seam allowance. So that's kind of crucial just to bear in mind, but that's not even what I'm getting at when I say one of the things to watch are your seam allowances. I mean when you're finishing your seam allowances. So if you have, for instance, a curved neckline or a curved collar, you want to always make sure you grade and you snip into those curves, because the chances are that if you have a facing that's poking out and you've understitched it, you probably haven't actually graded and clipped into those seam allowances, which will reduce the bulk of your garment at that seam and help it to sit really flat. Tip number 5, and you can tell that these are in no particular order whatsoever. Tip number 5 is to be careful when cutting. And I know this sounds really, really obvious, but you would be surprised about how many people cut corners at this step. Whether you're on team scissors or team rotary cutter, personally, scissors are all I ever use, even with more slippery fabrics. I probably haven't used my rotary cutter in about a year. But whether or not you use those, or whether you use pins and weights, the key thing to remember is to always take care with this step, because if you're not careful with the cutting of your fabric, you're not going to get the perfect fit. And you could have made all the efforts in the world to get the measurements right and choose the right size and make all those adjustments, but if you're not careful with the way you cut your fabric, all of that hard work has been undone. Honestly, I think what we need to remember at the end of the day, that is, sewing is only this much of the process. All of the work is entailed in other things. My 8-year-old niece can sew. A kid can use a sewing machine, but not everyone can take the time to cut out properly, to make adjustments to patterns, to press things properly. And really, I know that it just sounds like work when I put it this way, but it is work. And if you want a professional looking garment, a garment that doesn't look like you've made it, and I think that's the key for me, that's what I'm always going for, you need to put in the work and do those things that I've been talking about today. There are so many other things that I could recommend you do, but if you do those 5, I guarantee you will have professional looking garments at the end of it. And I think it's lovely to get a compliment from somebody that they love your dress, and to see the shock on their face whenever you tell them you've made it, because actually they'd have had no idea otherwise had you not told them. So yeah, follow those 5 tips. I don't think you'll go far wrong. So thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you fancy getting more tips and techniques in future videos, and do get in touch with me in the comments if you want any more information on all of those things, or you think there's anything that is vital that I have missed. I'd love to know what you think that is. So happy sewing, everyone. Bye.